It took less than a second. 1 second for the clasp to give, 1 second for the gold to arc through the candlelit air, 1 second for 3 years of careful invisibility to dissolve completely. I didn't even hear it land. I heard the silence that followed, the way every whispered deal, every clinking glass, every breath in the gilded lily seemed to hold at once. And then I saw his hand. Tattooed knuckles, a watch worth more than my entire life's earnings. Elliot Riley's fingers closed around my necklace with the slow, deliberate certainty of a man who had never once reached for something he didn't intend to keep. He didn't look at me, not at first. He turned the pendant over in his palm, the gold crest my mother had pressed into my hands on the last night I ever saw her, and something moved behind his eyes. Not curiosity, not greed. Recognition. When his gaze finally lifted to mine, the most feared man in New York's underworld looked at me, a waitress in a burgundy apron with flowers still on my sleeve, as though he had been waiting a very long time. "Where?" he said quietly, his voice dropping below the music, below the crowd, to somewhere only I could hear it. "Did you get this?" The Gilded Lily didn't smell like a bar. It smelled like privilege, polished mahogany, amber whiskey poured from bottles older than Alicia Woods herself, and beneath it all, the faint metallic undercurrent of power that has nowhere left to climb, the kind of air that makes working-class lungs feel like trespassers. Alicia tightened her apron strings and breathed through it. Table 9, in and out. Marco, the floor manager, appeared at her shoulder like a bad habit. He had the particular talent of materializing only when she was already carrying too much. "The Riley party doesn't like to be hovered over, Woods. Drop the bourbon, pull back, and for the love of God," his eyes dropped to the faint gold glimmer at her collarbone. "Tuck that thing in. This isn't a flea market." "Yes, Marco." She pressed one finger to the pendant through her shirt, her private ritual, the small anchor she'd used to survive every rude customer, every split shift, every bare refrigerator at the end of a long month, and lifted the tray. Table 9 occupied the alcove near the back wall, a deliberate position. Not a corner booth hidden in shadow, but a commanding vantage point from which a man could watch every door without appearing to watch anything at all. Alicia knew who sat there before she rounded the partition. Everyone in Manhattan knew Elliot Riley. Not from headlines, his name rarely appeared in print, and when it did, it was buried in the business columns alongside legitimate real estate acquisitions and charitable endowments with suspiciously round numbers. You knew him the way you knew a city's fault lines, not from seeing them, but from feeling the ground hold its breath beneath your feet. In person, he was worse. He sat with his jacket unbuttoned, one arm resting along the back of the seat, entirely at ease in a way that had nothing to do with relaxation and everything to do with dominion. Dark hair, silver at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been quarried, tattoos climbing his forearms, disappearing beneath a black shirt that cost more than Alicia's monthly rent. The men beside him were large and quiet, in the specific way of people trained to be both. He wasn't looking at her. She was glad. Alicia set the first glass down, then the second. Steady. She'd done this 1,000 times. Her hands knew the choreography even when the rest of her was screaming to move faster, get clear, become invisible again. She reached across the table for the coaster. The clasp went. It was such a small sound, a faint, dry tick, that only she heard it. And then the weight she had worn every day for 3 years was gone, and the necklace was falling in a slow gold arc, and Alicia's world began its pivot on the point of that single falling thing. It landed on the table in front of Elliot Riley. He looked down at it, and the room, which had not gone quiet, went very, very quiet inside Alicia's chest. "I'm so sorry," she started. His hand moved, unhurried. The tattooed fingers closed around the crest, lifted it from the tablecloth, and held it to the candlelight with the reverence of a man handling something sacred. Or something dangerous. In Elliot Riley's world, Alicia suspected those were the same thing. The color left his face. Not the flush of surprise or the pallor of illness. This was deeper, the gray that rolls in when a man encounters something he believed no longer existed in the world. His second-in-command leaned forward. A hand moved toward a jacket lapel. Elliot stopped it with one raised finger, without looking. Then he looked at her. Really looked. Not the absent gaze of a powerful man cataloging the help, but the focused, terrible attention of someone who has just had a ghost walk through his wall and sit down at his table. "Where did you get that?" Alicia's mouth opened. 3 years of "yes, sir," and "right away," and "so sorry to bother you," lined up dutifully at the back of her throat. None of them came out. Because something older than politeness stirred in her chest, something that recognized the weight of that question the way a key recognizes its lock. "It was my mother's," she said. Elliot Riley set down his glass. Slowly. He turned the pendant once more in his fingers, his jaw working over some private calculation. "What was your mother's name?" And somewhere in the deep marrow of her, Alicia Woods, the waitress, the invisible, the woman who had learned to make herself small enough to disappear, felt the first tremor of the earthquake that had been waiting beneath her ordinary life for 26 years. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 5,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this, stories about women who spent their whole lives being invisible only to discover they were never supposed to be, deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Hit subscribe and let's find out what that necklace really means. Alicia had never been inside a car that drove in silence so completely it felt deliberate. Not the silence of nothing to say, the silence of a man who had already decided everything and was simply waiting for the world to catch up to his conclusions. Elliot Riley sat beside her in the back seat, with 3 inches of dark leather between them, his eyes on the city sliding past the tinted window, the gold crest turning slowly between his fingers, like a coin he was deciding whether to spend. She told herself she'd agreed to come. That was the word he'd used. Come, not follow, not move. "You'll come with me tonight," delivered in the same low register as his question about her mother, as though both were simply facts that hadn't arranged themselves yet. And she had stood there in her apron with her empty tray and the broken clasp still warm in her palm, and she had gone. The estate announced itself through iron gates and a half-mile of gravel that crunched under the tires like quiet applause. The house beyond was the kind of old that money builds on purpose, stone facades and tall windows throwing amber light across manicured dark, beautiful in the way of things that have never needed to ask permission. A room was prepared, of course it was. "You'll be comfortable here," said the man who'd brought her. Not Elliot, but someone who moved like Elliot's extension, and the door closed with a softness that was somehow louder than a slam. Alicia tried it at midnight. Locked. She stood with her hand on the handle for a long moment, listening to the estate breathe around her, the distant murmur of voices, the creak of old wood, the particular hush of a place that keeps secrets as a structural feature. Then she crossed to the window, gravel 3 floors down, 2 men she recognized from the car, stationed at the garden's edge, not pacing, waiting. Protection, he'd said. She turned the word over the way he'd turned her necklace, examining it from every angle, testing its weight, finding the place where it stopped being true. She was a guest here the way a key is a guest in a lock. She wouldn't be leaving until she told him everything. He came for her at dawn. No knock, just the quiet turn of the lock, and Elliot Riley in the doorway, jacket gone, sleeves rolled to the forearm, a leather-bound file tucked under one arm, as though they were colleagues meeting for a briefing, rather than a man returning to check on his captive. He studied her face the way he'd studied the crest, with the careful attention of someone reading a language they thought they'd never encounter again. "Come downstairs," he said, not unkindly, not a request either. The study smelled of wood smoke and old paper. He set the file on the table between them and opened it without ceremony, the way a man opens something he has carried alone for a very long time and is only now setting down. The first photograph stopped her breath. Black and white, edges soft with age. A woman stood at the head of a long table surrounded by men in dark suits, her posture the kind that isn't learned but inherited, straight-spined, unhurried, occupying her authority the way a river occupies its banks. She wore the crest at her throat, and her face was Alicia's face, the same jaw, the same eyes, the same particular stillness that Alicia had always read as shyness, and now, looking at this woman, understood was something else entirely. Her name was Nadia Voss. Elliot's voice was careful, measured. She ran the most powerful syndicate this city has ever seen, not beside a man, not through one, alone. He turned to the next photograph, the same woman, younger now, laughing at something off camera, the crest catching light. The eternal crest was her seal. Every alliance made under it was binding, every order given beneath it, final. When she died, the men who feared her buried the symbol with her bloodline. He paused, or believed they had. Alicia couldn't look away from the first photograph, from her own face, 30 years younger than she would ever be, standing at the height of something she hadn't known existed. "She was my mother's mother," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. The shape of it had been assembling itself since midnight. Elliot closed the file. He looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't yet name, part calculation, part something raw beneath it. "You're not a waitress, Alicia. You never were." The window shattered at 2 a.m. Not the one in her room, somewhere below, on the east wing, a sound like a held breath finally breaking. Alicia was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with her knees drawn up, doing the arithmetic of her situation for the 100th time, when the night outside cracked open with the flat percussion of gunfire. She didn't scream. She wasn't sure why. Some cold, newly woken instinct simply stood up inside her and said, "Floor," and she dropped to it, pressing herself against the side of the bed as boots hammered the corridor outside her door. Then the door came open, not forced, but fast, and Elliot Riley filled the frame. He was different in the dark. The composed, glacial man from the restaurant had been replaced by something older and more honest. He was armed. He moved with the fluid economy of someone for whom violence was not an escalation, but a language, and he spoke it without hesitation or apology. "With me," he said, not a request. She went. He kept her behind him through every corridor, every turn, one arm extended back as a barrier she hadn't asked for and couldn't bring herself to resent. When two men appeared at the far end of the hallway, wrong faces, wrong energy, the specific blankness of men paid not to think, Elliot moved in front of her so completely she could only hear what followed. It was brief. It was not gentle. In a windowless room at the manor's core, he pushed her through the door and turned to face her. A cut along his jaw was bleeding in a thin, patient line. He didn't touch it. "They came for the crest," he said, "or for you. At this point, the distinction barely matters." "Who are they?" "People who believed you didn't exist." He crossed the room and crouched in front of her, bringing his eyes level with hers for the first time, not looming, not commanding, looking. "They know now, which means every hour you spend not telling me the truth about your mother is an hour working against you." Outside, the estate had gone quiet again. The silence no longer felt like his weapon. It felt like a wall he was building around her. She found it because she couldn't sleep, and the necklace was the only thing in the room that belonged to her. Elliot had returned it without ceremony after the ambush, set it on the table beside her door with the clasp repaired, no explanation of when or by whom, and she had held it for a long time in the dark before she thought to press the crest the way her mother had always pressed it when she thought Alicia wasn't watching. A private gesture, quick and habitual, like crossing yourself before something you feared. The back panel released. It was not a locket she had known was a locket. The seam was invisible unless you knew exactly where to press, and inside, folded to the dimensions of a secret, was a square of paper so thin it felt like dried skin against her fingers. The handwriting was her mother's, small and precise and slightly left-leaning, the hand of a woman who had learned penmanship somewhere formal and forgotten it was supposed to show. My darling, if you are reading this, I am already gone, and I am sorry it took my absence to give you the truth. Alicia sat down on the floor. The letter did not waste time on comfort. Her mother had never been a woman who confused tenderness with honesty. It moved quickly. The family name Alicia had never been given, the bloodline that carried it, the fortune and authority it represented to the men who had spent decades believing they'd erased it entirely. The council of elders, trusted figures, men who had sat at her grandfather's table, eaten his food, and then systematically dismantled everything he had built the moment his back was turned. The great betrayal, her mother called it, with the flat certainty of someone who had lived inside its aftermath every day since. They will tell you we were nobodies. We were not nobodies. We were inconvenient. They had hidden not from weakness but from mathematics. 2 women alone against a council of 8, in a city those 8 men owned. Survival had required invisibility. Invisibility had required silence. Silence had required Alicia to grow up believing she was ordinary. You were never ordinary, my love. I only needed you to believe it long enough to stay alive. The candle on the nightstand burned down an inch before Alicia moved again. If that letter just hit you, if you felt the weight of a mother making her daughter believe she was ordinary just to keep her breathing, drop the word ordinary in the comments. I want to know how many of you felt that. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the moment. This is what we do here. She showed him the letter at dawn. Not because she had decided to trust him, trust was a luxury that required more runway than she currently had, but because the mathematics had shifted. The ambush had made the walls of her silence thinner than the paper she'd spent the night reading. She handed it across the breakfast table without preamble and watched his face while he read it, looking for the thing that would tell her she'd made a mistake. His expression didn't change. That, somehow, was the most honest response he could have given her. Your mother was right about the council, he said, folding the letter along its original creases with a care that surprised her. She was also right that you can't move against them the way you are now. How am I now? He looked at her steadily, visible, reactive, still waiting for permission to take up space. It should have stung more than it did. Instead, it landed with the dull accuracy of something she already knew. What followed was not gentle. Elliot Riley did not appear to own the concept of easing someone in. He began that same morning, not with weapons or tactics, but with something more unsettling. He made her walk into rooms first, made her sit at the head of every table. When his lieutenants assembled in the East Study, he positioned her at the center and said nothing, waiting with the patience of a man who had built empires on other people's discomfort, until she stopped looking at the floor. A room decides what you are in the first 4 seconds, before you speak, before you move. They're reading your certainty. Give them nothing to question. She practiced until her spine remembered it without instruction. He taught her to listen the way powerful people listen, not for what was said, but for the shape of what was being carefully avoided. He taught her that silence, deployed correctly, was not an absence but a pressure, that a question left unanswered in the right company could move faster than any threat. He watched her absorb it all with an expression she couldn't fully read, part calculation, part something quieter that he hadn't yet chosen to name. She didn't ask him to name it. She was too busy becoming someone who no longer needed to ask. The invitation arrived on black cardstock with no return address, which Elliot said meant it wasn't truly an invitation. Then what is it? Alicia asked. A test. They want to see what we know. We want to see who flinches. He set the card on the desk between them. We're going. She wore midnight blue, Elliot's choice, delivered to her room without comment, cut in the language of old money rather than new. No excess, no apology. The kind of dress that understood its own authority. She stood before the mirror and practiced what he had taught her. Chin level, shoulders settled, the particular stillness of a person who has nowhere more important to be and knows it. Then she fastened the crest at her throat, outside it, for the first time, against the fabric, against the light, where anyone with eyes and the right history could see it. Her reflection looked back at her like a question finally answered. The gala occupied the top 3 floors of a building that officially hosted a private equity firm and unofficially hosted everything that private equity was designed to launder. The elevator opened onto candlelight and string music, and 200 people who had collectively agreed that elegance was the most effective form of menace. Elliot entered first, which was the plan, drawing the room's attention the way he always did, like gravity, effortless and total. Then Alicia stepped through. The shockwave was not loud. It moved the way fault lines move, beneath the surface, felt before it was seen. She watched it travel, a stillness that jumped from face to face across the room, like a flame finding new paper. Glasses paused halfway to lips, conversations lost their thread. An older man near the far wall went a particular shade of pale that she recognized now as the color of a man confronting something he believed he had buried. Elliot appeared at her shoulder. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence beside her was its own sentence, and the room was reading it. "They're afraid," she said, quietly, without moving her lips. "Good," he said, equally quiet. "Let them be afraid first. Let them wonder how much you know. A beat. Do you remember what I told you about silence?" She looked out across the room full of men who had erased her family. "Yes," she said, and smiled. The stronghold was underneath a church. Elliot had said it without irony, which was somehow the most damning detail, that the Council of Elders had built their vault of stolen legacies beneath stained glass and consecrated stone, as though proximity to the sacred could retroactively sanctify what they had taken. The entrance was a vestry door at the back of a nave that smelled of cold incense and older sins. They went in at midnight, 2 of Elliot's men ahead and 1 behind, and Alicia moving at the center of a formation she had not yet fully earned but was no longer afraid to occupy. The trouble came at the second corridor. A door they had been told would be clear was not clear, and for 30 seconds the narrow passage became very loud and very small, and Alicia pressed herself against the stone wall with her heart conducting itself frantically against her ribs. When it was over, one of Elliot's men was down, not dead but finished for the night, and the path forward was a single locked door that her mother's letter had described in precise, loving detail. The lock required the crest. She had known this. What she hadn't fully understood until this moment, standing in a subterranean corridor with Elliot Riley bleeding quietly from his left side and watching her with an expression stripped of everything except honesty, was what it meant to press forward. "If I open this," she said, "there's no version of after where I go back." "No," he said simply. "There isn't." She looked at him, the man who had locked her in a room and then built a wall around her with his body, who had handed her silence as a weapon and watched her learn to aim it, who was standing here now, wounded, having never once suggested she owe him anything for it. "If this goes wrong," she said, "it won't." But if it does, he held her gaze without flinching. Then it goes wrong with me beside you. That's the only answer I have. It was enough. She didn't know exactly when it had become enough, but it had. Alicia pressed the crest into the lock. The door exhaled like something that had been holding its breath for 26 years, and she walked through it. The council fell quietly, which surprised her. She had expected theater, denials, counter-accusations, the desperate noise of men who had spent decades perfecting their innocence. Instead, when she laid the contents of the vault across the table at the assembly of syndicate heads 3 days later, the ledgers, the bloodline documents, the letters bearing the council's own seals authorizing the great betrayal, the room simply went the specific silence of a verdict being accepted before it is read aloud. The oldest elder looked at the crest at her throat, then at her face, then at something beyond both that only he could see. "You have your mother's eyes," he said. "I have her patience, too," Alicia replied. "I've decided to stop using it on your behalf." Nobody laughed. Nobody was meant to. What followed was not a coronation. There was no ceremony, no formal transfer, nothing that could later be described as theatrical or illegitimate. Power, she had learned, rarely announced itself. It simply redistributed, like water finding its new level, and the men in that room were too pragmatic and too old to resist a current they could already feel beneath their feet. One by one, they acknowledged her. Not with warmth, not all of them, but with the particular respect that has nothing to do with affection and everything to do with recognizing an authority that will not be moved. Elliot signed nothing. His presence required no documentation. Afterwards, standing at the window of what had been her grandfather's office and was now simply hers, Alicia turned the necklace over in her fingers, the habit she had inherited from her mother without knowing it was an inheritance. The city spread below in its indifferent, magnificent sprawl, full of people living their ordinary lives above the fault lines they would never feel. She had been one of them 3 weeks ago. She had worn an apron and touched this crest for comfort in moments of fear, never knowing it was a key, never knowing what it opened, never knowing that the smallness she had accepted as her nature was not nature at all, but a story told to keep her safe. Elliot appeared beside her without announcement, the way he always did. "How does it feel?" he asked. She considered the question honestly. "Like I was always supposed to be standing here. I just needed someone to stop blocking the door." Thank you for watching this story of hidden bloodlines, buried power, and the waitress who discovered she was never supposed to be invisible. If you enjoyed the twists and turns of this one, please smash that like button. It helps us create more stories exactly like this. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a beat of our next drama. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. See you in the next one.